The smell of burnt coffee and my brother's cologne hit me the moment I walked into the office that Monday morning. He always wore too much of it. That should have been my first warning. I am a 28-year-old accountant who spent 4 years building a reputation in a company that happened to share our last name. Hollowell and Associates. My grandfather started it. My father inherited it. And my brother Garrett was supposed to run it someday. That was the plan anyway. Always had been. I was just the daughter who was good with numbers, which made me useful in the way a calculator is useful, necessary, but replaceable. I didn't mind. I genuinely didn't. I loved the work. I loved the clean logic of a balanced ledger, the satisfaction of a quarterly report that told the truth. I was the controller of our mid-sized logistics firm responsible for every dollar that moved in and out of 14 accounts across 3 states. I had earned that title. I had not been handed it. That distinction mattered to me more than I can explain. Garrett was VP of Operations, 41 years old, going on 17. He drove a lease he couldn't afford on his own salary and had been quietly raiding petty cash for client entertainment for as long as I could remember. I had flagged it twice in internal memos. Both times, my father had called me into his office, closed the door, and explained in his measured boardroom voice that I was being paranoid, that Garrett was building relationships, that I needed to understand how the real world worked. I understood how the real world worked. I also understood that client entertainment doesn't usually add up to $62,000 in 18 months. I documented everything. That was just how my brain operated. I kept a shadow ledger, my own personal copy of every transaction, backed up automatically to a private cloud account I had set up years ago. It was a habit from a security course I had taken, something about disaster recovery and audit trails. It was not, at the time, something I did because I suspected my own family. It was just what you did when you were responsible for other people's money. You kept receipts. The call came on a Tuesday in March. Our external auditors had flagged a discrepancy, not the petty cash, something bigger. A wire transfer, $340,000, moved in 3 tranches over 6 weeks from our operating account to a shell LLC called Ridgecroft Consulting. Ridgecroft had no website, no employees, no physical address. It existed only on paper filed in Delaware, and the name on the filing was not my brother's. It was mine. I found out from my father, not from the auditors. He called me at 7 in the morning, and I remember exactly what I was doing. Standing in my kitchen, still in socks, eating toast over the sink. "We have a problem," he said. "You need to come in. Right now." When I got to the office, the CFO, our outside legal counsel, and my parents were all seated around the conference table. Garrett was not there. Garrett was never where the consequences were. My father slid a folder across the table toward me. Inside was a printout of the wire transfers and a copy of the Ridgecroft LLC filing with my name printed on it in black and white. I stared at it for a long time. "I didn't do this," I said. My father pressed his hands flat on the table. He had a habit of doing that when he was about to say something he needed you to sit still for. "We know things have been stressful," he said. "The workload, the pressure, you've been carrying a lot." "I didn't do this," I said again, slower. My mother, who had been silent in the corner, leaned forward. Her voice was the kind of careful that takes years to perfect, smooth and maternal and completely hollow underneath. "Sweetheart, the best thing right now is to get ahead of this quietly. If we go to the auditors and make this a formal investigation, it becomes public. It becomes a news story. It destroys the company your grandfather built. It destroys your father." She paused. "It destroys Garrett." And there it was. "The transfers were made from a terminal registered to your login," my father said. "Your credentials, your access window, the documentation all points to you. Because someone used my credentials," I said. I looked at the CFO, a man named Hargrove who had been with the firm for 20 years and had always liked Garrett better than he liked me, which said something. Someone with access to my workstation, someone who knew my login. My father exhaled. A long practiced exhale. "Garrett is in the middle of a deal," he said. "A real estate partnership. If his name comes up in an embezzlement investigation, even tangentially, the whole thing collapses. We're talking about $8 million. His future. His future, I repeated. My mother folded her hands in her lap. You're the accountant, Claire. If you say it was a bookkeeping error, a misclassification you didn't catch in time, we can frame it as negligence rather than fraud. A fine, maybe. You keep your CPA license with conditions. Garrett keeps the deal. The company survives. I want you to understand what she was asking me. Not just to take the blame. To admit, in writing, to a federal-level financial crime. Accounting fraud. Wire fraud. The kind of thing that can mean 5 to 10 years even on a plea. If you don't, my father said, and his voice went very quiet the way it always did when he was done negotiating and had moved into ultimatum, we will be forced to present the evidence as it stands to the auditors. The documentation points to you. The attorneys have advised us that the most defensible position for the company is to cooperate fully and name a responsible party. I felt the air leave the room. You'd hand me to the auditors, I said. Knowingly, we'd be presenting the facts, he said. As they exist, my mother added softly, you don't have a husband, you don't have children. Garrett has Melissa and the kids. You're in a position to weather this in a way that he simply isn't. As if my life mattered less because I had chosen not to fill it with certain things. As if I were a variable they could reassign. I looked at both of them. I looked at Hargrove, who was staring at the wall. Then I looked back at my father. Fine, I said. I need some time to think. That was not agreement, but they heard what they wanted to hear. They gave me the weekend. I drove home in a state that I can only describe as a very calm kind of falling apart. My hands were steady on the wheel. My eyes were dry. But something in my chest had cracked clean through, and I could feel the air moving in places that were supposed to be solid. I sat in my apartment for 2 hours without turning on the lights. Then I opened my laptop, the shadow ledger. I had been keeping it for 3 years, every transaction mirrored in real time to my private account, time-stamped with source documentation attached. It was complete through the previous Friday. Every wire transfer, every approval, every authorization log, including the Ridgecroft transfers. My credentials had been used, that part was true. But credentials have logs. Access logs show not just what account was used, but from which terminal, at what IP address, at what exact time. What my father and Hargrove had shown me was the transaction record. They had not shown me the access log. I pulled up my own copy. The 3 Ridgecroft transfers were initiated from a terminal in the building, not my workstation. The IP address was registered to the VPN tunnel used by executive offices. Garrett's office. The timestamps were also illuminating. 2 of the 3 transfers occurred on days I had been out of office. One was a Tuesday I had taken as a sick day, documented in our HR system. Another was the day of my cousin's wedding in Vermont, for which I had submitted a PTO request 6 weeks in advance and had 40 people who could confirm I was 400 miles away. Garrett had not just used my credentials. He had been sloppy about it. He had always assumed that no one was watching him as carefully as he watched himself in the mirror. I also found something else in the logs. 3 weeks before the transfers, someone had accessed the admin panel for our credential management system and changed the timeout settings on my login, extended them, made it so that my session would remain active and undetected longer than standard. That access had also come from the executive IP tunnel. He had planned this. It wasn't impulsive. He had looked at me and decided I was the safest place to put the blame, and he had constructed the frame carefully and in advance, and my own parents had looked at the finished frame and decided it was more convenient than the truth. I spent the rest of that night organizing everything into a single folder. Every log, every timestamp, every PTO record, every piece of documentation I had. I compiled it into a single PDF and wrote a cover memo explaining each exhibit. Then I did something I had read about in a continuing education course on corporate fraud prevention. I uploaded the entire package to a secure document sharing platform and set it on a 72-hour auto-delivery timer addressed to 3 recipients: the audit partner at our external auditing firm, the state CPA licensing board, and the FBI's financial crimes tip portal. The timer would stop only if I logged back in and manually canceled it. I did not tell my family. On Sunday evening, my father called. "Have you made a decision?" "I'm still thinking," I said. "Claire." His voice had that patient, immovable quality. We need this resolved before the auditors return on Wednesday. I understand, I said. You have until Tuesday morning. If we don't hear from you, we'll contact the attorneys and proceed. I understand, I said again. I slept better than I had in weeks. Monday morning, I went into the office. I sat at my desk. I did my work. I said good morning to the receptionist and refilled the printer paper in the copy room because it was always empty and no one else ever did it. Just a regular Monday. At 11, my father called me into his office. Garrett was there this time, leaning against the windowsill, his arms crossed, looking at his phone. He didn't look at me when I came in. My father closed the door. We'd like to move forward, he said. We've prepared a statement for you to review. It frames the Ridgecroft transfers as an error in judgment during a period of personal difficulty, stress, burnout. The attorneys believe we can avoid criminal referral if we act quickly and you cooperate fully. He slid a single page across the desk, a written confession, already drafted, with a blank line for my signature. I looked at it for a moment. Then I looked at Garrett. He was still looking at his phone. His jaw was set in that particular way he had, that performance of being above the situation. He had done the same thing when we were kids, and he had broken something of mine and denied it to our parents. He had a very specific face for getting away with things. I picked up the paper. One question, I said. My father nodded. The Ridgecroft transfers. Were they initiated from my workstation? Your credentials were used, my father said. That's not what I asked. Were they initiated from my workstation or from a different terminal? A pause. The technical details are. I have the access logs, I said. The room changed. Garrett looked up from his phone for the first time. I've been maintaining a mirrored backup of our full transaction and access database for 3 years, I continued. My voice was very even. I was almost surprised by how even it was. The logs show the transfers originated from the executive VPN tunnel, specifically from the terminal assigned to Garrett's office, on 2 dates when I was not in the building, which is documented in HR records. My father said, Claire, I also have the admin log showing that someone modified my credential timeout settings 3 weeks before the first transfer. That access also came from the executive tunnel. The room was very quiet. I've already sent the documentation, I said. It was not true yet. The timer was still running, but it was going to be true, and that was close enough. It went to the audit firm, the licensing board, and federal financial crimes. That part landed the way I thought it would. My father stood up. You did not do that. I did. And there's a 72-hour delivery timer on a second package that will send automatically unless I cancel it. I haven't decided yet whether I will. Garrett's phone was in his hand, but he had stopped pretending to look at it. His face had done something I had never seen it do before. It had gone genuinely uncertain. You are going to destroy this family, my father said. His voice was no longer measured. It had cracked slightly at the edges. Garrett already did that, I said. I'm just making sure I don't go down with it. My mother appeared in the doorway. She must have been just outside because she came in too fast to have come from anywhere else. Claire, please, she said. Think about what you're doing. Think about the children, Melissa and the kids. I thought about it, I said. Over the weekend, while I was thinking, I stood up and put the unsigned confession back on my father's desk. I'm going back to my office, I said. I have a report to finish. I walked out. I want to tell you that I felt triumphant in that moment, striding down the hallway while the door swung shut behind me. I didn't. I felt like I was moving through water. I sat at my desk and stared at my computer screen and thought about Thanksgiving dinners and my grandmother's china and the way my father used to let me sit next to him at his desk when I was small, showing me how to read a balance sheet. I thought about all the versions of this family that we used to be, or that I used to believe we were. Then I opened the report and finished it, because it still needed to be done. The auditors arrived Wednesday as scheduled. I was not in the conference room when the meeting began. I was at my desk. At 9:47 a.m., Hargrove appeared in my doorway. The auditors would like to speak with you, he said. The lead auditor's name was Patricia. She was a compact woman in her late 50s who wore no jewelry except a single thin watch and had the kind of stillness that comes from spending a career in rooms where people lie to her. She already had my documentation. The external firm had received the auto-delivered package that morning as scheduled. She had questions about the access logs, the admin panel modification, and the timeline of my PTO records. I answered everything. In the adjacent conference room, separated by a glass partition and a set of closed blinds, my father and Garrett were meeting with the company's legal team. I could see shadows through the blinds. At one point, a chair moved sharply. At another point, the shadows were still for a very long time. Patricia looked at the logs again. Then she looked at me. "You've been keeping this backup independently for 3 years," she said. "Yes," I said. "That's unusual." "I took a fraud prevention course," I said. "It made an impression." She almost smiled. "It appears so." The formal referral to the state attorney general's office happened 11 days later. The charges against Garrett were filed 6 weeks after that. Wire fraud, embezzlement, misuse of company funds. His Delaware LLC, Ridgecroft Consulting, was dissolved by court order. The real estate partnership he had been protecting collapsed anyway, because it turned out one of his partners had been watching the news. My parents were not charged, but the attorney's fees consumed most of what they had saved, and the company's board, which had previously been a polite rubber stamp, voted to remove my father from the executive role pending a governance review. He had known about the LLC, the investigators determined, or had willful reason to know. He had made the choice to look away. My mother called me 3 times in the week after the charges were filed. I let all 3 calls go to voicemail. On the last one, she said, "I hope you understand what you've done." She said it quietly, without heat, as if she genuinely could not locate herself as a participant in any of it. I listened to that voicemail exactly once. There was a separate matter that I had not anticipated. My grandfather, who had died 7 years earlier, had structured his estate with a specific clause that my family's attorney had apparently never explained clearly to anyone, or perhaps had explained and my parents had simply not absorbed it. The clause stated that in the event any named trustee was formally charged with financial crimes related to the company, their interest in the residual estate would transfer to the next eligible descendant in good standing. My grandfather's residual estate after 7 years of investment was worth approximately $3.4 million. The family attorney called me on a Thursday morning while I was eating cereal at my kitchen table. "Miss Hollowell," he said, "I have some paperwork I'd like to walk you through." I put down my spoon. He explained the clause. He explained the transfer. He explained that I was, as of that week, the sole beneficiary. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. $3.4 million. The same grandfather who had taught me to read a balance sheet at his knee. Who had told me more than once that the numbers always tell the truth, even when people don't. I don't know if he had anticipated something like this. I don't know if he had simply been a careful man who understood that money, like people, could be stolen from and had built in a protection accordingly. Either way, it felt like something. I still work in accounting. Different company now. I accepted a controller position at a firm in another city 3 months after everything settled. New city, new office, a desk next to a window that looks out at a canal. My colleagues do not know my last name's history. I am just Claire, the one who is very particular about documentation. The fraud prevention course I took 5 years ago cost $480. I have thought about that number often lately. Garrett is awaiting sentencing. His attorney is arguing for leniency based on stress and financial pressure, which, if you have followed this story at all, will have a familiar sound to it. I don't wish him anything specific. I don't spend much time thinking about him, honestly. I spend more time thinking about my grandfather, about the trust he put into a clause in a document, a small, quiet belief that eventually the right person would be left standing. I think he would have appreciated the access logs. He was always very particular about documentation too. I start work at 8 every morning. I keep backups of everything, and I have learned more thoroughly than I ever wanted to that the numbers do not lie. They just wait. I think about the fraud prevention course a lot. $480. A Tuesday evening in a rented conference room with bad lighting and lukewarm coffee, and an instructor who kept repeating one phrase that I wrote down almost without thinking: document everything, because memory is unreliable but a timestamp is not. I did not take that course because I suspected my brother. I took it because I was responsible for other people's money, and I took that seriously. That's the part that still gets me, sometimes, when I let myself sit with it. I was doing the right thing for ordinary reasons, just being careful, just being professional, and it turned out those ordinary habits were the only thing standing between me and a federal fraud charge. There's something in that worth sitting with. I don't think Garrett set out to be the person he became. I think he made one small compromise early on, told himself it was temporary, and then made another and another and another until the compromises were load-bearing walls and he couldn't see the original structure anymore. That's how it usually works. Not a sudden villain origin story. Just a long series of quiet choices, each one slightly easier than the last, because the previous one had already moved the line. My parents did the same thing. They looked at what Garrett had done and they made a choice, not a dramatic cinematic choice, but a quiet one. The kind you make at a conference table while everyone's looking at a folder. They chose protection over truth, and then they built a story around that choice, and by the end, they had convinced themselves, I think, that they were doing what any family would do, that I was the collateral, not the victim. I don't say that to excuse them. I say it because understanding how people arrive at terrible decisions is different from accepting those decisions. You can comprehend the path without agreeing with the destination. What I had was not courage in the movie sense. I wasn't fearless. I was terrified, genuinely, sitting in my apartment with the lights off. But fear and action are not mutually exclusive. You can be shaking and still open the laptop. You can feel the ground moving and still keep your hands steady enough to compile a folder of exhibits. That steadiness came from the work, from 3 years of discipline that had nothing to do with drama and everything to do with just doing the job right, every day when no one was watching and no one was going to reward you for it. Integrity is mostly invisible until the moment it isn't. Patricia, the auditor, noticed it immediately, not because I was exceptional, but because the record was clean and complete and honest in a way that records only are when someone has been quietly telling the truth for a long time. My grandfather built a company. He also built a clause in a document that protected the person who would still be standing when the truth came out. I don't know if he knew it would be me. But I know he understood that in the long run, the numbers always tell the story. You just have to make sure you're the one keeping them. I still back up everything. I still arrive early. I still refill the printer paper when it's empty, because it's always empty and someone has to. Some things don't change after an experience like this. They just become more deliberate. The access logs were always there. Garrett just assumed no one would ever pull them. That is the only tiny detail he forgot, and it was enough.